Welcome to Gatecrashers, a podcast dedicated to kicking open the door to your next favorite thing. Our mission, our creed, our code is this: to make all nerdy things more approachable and accessible to everyone. We want you to find a universe that you fall in love with. Today, we are joined by the writer of the I Survive series for Scholastic, which has been adapted into 3 graphic novels, Lauren Tarshis.
Hi, Scarlett.
Hi. It's wonderful to have you. I'm actually really excited because, as Dan said earlier, I am the resident history buff, history major of the group. I teach U.S. history, and it was really great to actually read this book, that I Survived the Nazi Invasion, because I'm actually teaching this right now. We are just about to finish up the home front section of US. I teach US 2, and we're just about to finish up the home front section. And our last section in our World War II unit is the Holocaust. So I'm very excited because I'm like, oh, this is so great. I wish I could show my kids.
That must be so. I always thought that would be an incredibly, just a wonderful thing to do, to be able to really share history with high school students and get into these amazing conversations. And they're so open and, kind of ready to be fascinated.
Most of the time they are, especially when it comes to things like when it does come to these heavier topics and issues that I have noticed. They usually say, well, why do we have to talk about the Holocaust? We've kind of learned about it ever since we've been in middle school and older, higher elementary school, and they've heard about it. And then when I show them more in depth, they're like, oh, wow, I guess we really haven't learned about it. So it's kind of interesting to see that before and after of that history and that knowledge that they get from it.
I think I always say to kids that history really isn't facts and dates. Really, history is stories of ordinary people.
Right.
And I think when they start to look at it that way, and that their story will be part of history one day. So.
Exactly. I always tell them, because I'm not a big date person. There's a few dates I want them to remember, but it's more I like getting up there and telling the story. So I kind of use it as my personal, I was very big into theater. So it's like my personal stage, and I tell them the story and kind of weave a tale. And that's kind of how I view it. So I do agree. I think it's more stories and kind of weaving it all together versus just linear timeline.
Right.
So let's see. Dan, do you want to go ahead and ask the famous first question we ask all of our interviewees?
So we actually known as pretty hard-hitting journalists in our comic book world. So we always open up with a pretty hard, tough question. What's your favorite sandwich?
Ooh, my favorite sandwich. There's this amazing Italian deli here, and it's the Koufax sandwich. And it's so awesome that I could spend, do you have 20 minutes for me to describe it to you? Because it's this fresh roll, of course. Then it's a cutlet, of course. Then it's, it sounds actually fancy, but this is a very down and dirty, old school Italian deli. So I don't want to sound all highfalutin, but it does have, so it's broccoli rabe, provolone cheese, sauteed provolone cheese, prosciutto, some crazy sauce. And anyway, the Koufax.
That's incredible.
Yes. I wish I could bring you one right now.
I'm a huge broccoli rabe fan, so anytime anybody talks about it, I'm so excited because we only had a few guests who've mentioned it.
Oh, I'm glad. Well, this is it's actually sort of in our town. I grew up in this town, and the Koufax is it's a sacred sandwich.
I have to ask you about it after the show.
Okay.
When you started describing that, it was just, his mouth started watering. He loves all kinds of Italian hoagies and subs, and those are his so as soon as you mentioned that, the broccoli rabe and the prosciutto, I knew he was.
I'm very glad. I should have done, had I known, I would have done even deeper preparation for this interview.
So going into the I Survive series, so what exactly inspires you to take on writing those stories?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I think I have a few inspirations, and the initial inspiration was to enable all kinds of readers, especially reluctant readers or struggling readers, kids who were not the ones who were, reading Lord of the Rings when they were 9. I feel like since I was one of those readers, and I have 4 kids and my sons were those readers, and I feel like those readers are so curious. They want to know. So my challenge was to take complicated events, often complicated events, and write them in a way that they would be accessible and exciting to all kinds of kids. And then to hopefully kind of like you guys, it is a gate crashing is a great word, because I've never used that for myself, but it's more of a quiet door opening, for kids to want to learn more, to read about, a World War II story, or, the Revolutionary War, or even, something they'd never heard of, like the molasses flood of, in Boston, or the Hindenburg explosion, and to make them, curious and open their eyes and hopefully inspire them to maybe, want to go down one of those tributaries that they have curiosity about. So that was part of it. And then also, I've been writing for kids for many, 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 many years for Scholastic, for the classroom magazines at Scholastic. And I noticed that anytime I wrote a story with a kid in the middle of it, to your point, Scarlett, when it was a story instead of just information, those were the stories that kids and teachers were writing to me about, that they, didn't matter what it was. So I think it was a combination of these different forces.
I really I appreciate the fact that you mentioned wanting to make things accessible and to the readers that aren't, maybe they're not quite there yet, yeah. Or a struggling reader, because as a teacher, I've encountered those and having to break things down for them and kind of adapt. And there's another question I have later on that I'll get to that I think kind of ties into that perfectly. So another question is, how do you choose the topics for these stories? Is there a certain criteria it has to make, or do you go through, okay, this was a major event, this was something very big that happened? What's the kind of process to where you have to pick those out?
Right. Well, it's I've got a few answers. It's a little bit of a Byzantine process, but mostly what's been very striking to me is from the start of the series. I mean, the original series, I was going to just do long ago things, that mm-hmm. were not human made, that were, except maybe the Titanic, but, things that I wasn't going to get into really heavy, evil topics. And right away from the beginning, I also thought I would just do 4 of the books and move on, but right away kids started writing to me with ideas, and they really wanted, and to the point that we were talking about earlier, they were really curious about, the Holocaust, 9/11, the Revolutionary War, D-Day, so I started getting, I get a huge amount of mail from kids, email and letters, and it was really to offer me suggestions from the start. So I've been able to really follow my kids' leads throughout the series, and they've evolved it. They were the ones who really inspired me to do even, more current issues. Right away, they were asking for Hurricane Katrina, kids from New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, and teachers and librarians from there. 9/11 was one that I never imagined I would do, but it was a couple thousand emails asking for that one. So certainly the reader's interest is number one. And then what I do ask myself, there is a little bit of a test. And I ask myself, did this event change history or our ideas about things? So even something that seems like a localized event, like the tornado that hit Joplin, Missouri in 2011, that actually really did change ideas about tornado safety and sirens. And, so even something like the Great Boston Molasses Flood, where it's this tank of molasses that explodes in Boston in 1919, that actually really changed things. It not only it obliterated the neighborhood, so it had an immediate effect, but long-term, it was the first successful class action lawsuit where a company was held responsible for hurting people because of something they did. And it also changed building laws. Up until then, if you wanted to build like a huge tank and fill it with millions of gallons of molasses in someone's yard, if it was your property, you could without any sort of regulations. So I think that's a question. I always say that to kids too. Like when you're reading one of my books, or even any nonfiction history book, it's a really cool question to ask yourself. Like, what were the effects that you can trace back from today to that event that changed your life in some way? And I bet you'll find it.
I love that. Just everything. And I promise you, I'm not just saying that. I love talking history and like all of these things. Like
we could talk about sandwiches and history for a long time. Three of us.
Kind of tying back into what we had talked about before, how do you take a lot of these historical and mostly adult topics? I mean, like the Holocaust is not an easy topic to talk about. So how do you take some of these issues and scaffold them? That's a teaching term we use, the scaffolding. Yes. How do you scaffold it for a younger audience?
That's a great question. I would say that, well, first of all, I think you asked a really good question, sort of there's two things. First of all, I make it appropriate for kids? Because I have some very young readers. I mean, the graphic novels tend to, I think, have a slightly older kids are reading those. But, I have kids sometimes that are crazily young reading my series, with their parents. So how do you take an issue like the Holocaust and 9/11, or I'll say the Holocaust because it is just, the Holocaust is one of those topics that the more you read about it and the more you know, the more evil and incomprehensible it is. Like there's no understanding it. You can sort of understand something like Pearl Harbor, it's terrible, but you can read about the strategies and the economic pressures the Japanese were facing and what was going on. And you're like, okay, that you can understand it. But some events are so just evil, truly, that you can't explain it. And how do you you don't really want to expose kids to something that's incomprehensibly evil. So what I first do is I try to build sort of a wall around the event. Like for the Holocaust, I made the decision not to be in the camps. This is not a death murder camp story. This is about, I decided to make it fairly contained about the Jewish partisans, and put it in the forest, a small fictional forest, but based on real ones in Eastern Europe. So that's the first thing. And the same with 9/11. I didn't get into the ideology behind the attacks. I don't mention Osama bin Laden except in the very back matter in the nonfiction at the end. So to just sort of keep it was really a firefighter story, a first responder story, a concussion story, that book. It was very much a middle grade novel. And then to your point about scaffolding, that's the hardest thing of writing them is sometimes not just making something, easy to understand. How do you explain anti-Semitism in a way, that is not just glossing over things, but also not loading kids up with information and really step-by-step explaining it, but also making it, maybe that's not the right example, but something like the background of World War II, or when I did my D-Day book, I remember trying to help kids understand, well, okay, this is D-Day. It's involving like all these countries. It's in France, but it's the Germans that were attacking. And then it's this weird body of water no one's ever heard of, the English Channel. So it's just, how do you explain all that? So that just takes a lot of time and research, and you want to make it exciting too. You can't spend 3 paragraphs explaining that. It has to be quick. So that's definitely the stuff. I mean, so much about writing the series is so hard, very challenging, and it just doesn't get easier. And I think that that's certainly one of them, is taking these really nuanced, complicated, filled with like vocabulary that they don't, that kids have never heard of before, and trying to shape it in a way that they're going to understand it and remain engaged with.
Well, I think that you do a great a great job of scaffolding, but you also, from what I got when I was reading, I just got like the little hints, like if you're if you're a parent and you're reading this with your kid or a teacher, or you're an adult reading this, you get the little nods to things that happen. Like I was reading and they talk about, I think Max was talking about his family, his father's shop being like destroyed, and talking about Hitler's rise to become like the leader, and setting fire to like the synagogue. And I was just like, oh, so that's kind of like alluding to like Kristallnacht, and like, oh, they're in the ghettos. This is stuff's about to happen. So like knowing the context and the background for me as a history person, and just, I guess, as an adult in general, it was like, I like the little nods, and like, it's fun for not just the kids, but the adults as well, I think.
Well, thanks for saying that. It's true, because it's really that I was, as you were describing that scene, I was thinking about, the process of the graphic novels, which is, of course, different than writing the regular novels. It was very hard in the graphic novel to really make, and Georgia Ball, who adapts them, is just a genius. She does such an incredible job. I've told her many times and like lauded her on Twitter many times for her wonderful adaptations of my books. I'm so lucky that she's doing them. But, it was really hard to like provide that background there, and to give the kids the context they need to be able to, to go, to be able to understand what's happened next. So you're right, without spending, 20 pages on it.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. What is our next question? Let's see. Do you have a favorite time period of history? And if so, why is that your favorite time period?
I'm always drawn to sort of either, the kind of the late 1800s. I think that's the time I love the best, because there were so many, life was changing so crazily. It was the time when electricity, locomotives, there was this, it was very hopeful, like 1900, there was so much optimism and hope and hubris, and so many terrible things happened because of that. But there are also a lot of really great things happened because of that. It was the time when women started to really, agitate for more rights. And so I just think that a lot of the books, that I've written are kind of in that period. I mean, and I'm trying to de-emphasize it, but I keep getting drawn back to it. And kids, I mean, it was just a very rich time. A lot of stuff happened.
Yeah. I think I do like that time period. It is very interesting to kind of like reflect and like see, like you said, so many things were happening during that time. And, women were like we see the rise of like the suffragists and all of this stuff. And so it's a very uppity like time period. And so I think that's pretty cool.
It's also interesting because like here in America, what was so interesting is that like in the cities, it was very modern, like you had, by like 1910, you had motor cars and everyone had like indoor toilets, very fancy, all these things. But then in the countryside, you could, it was almost nothing had changed. It was the same as it was 100 years before. So that's another really interesting thing. And it's interesting today because I think that some of those divisions, it's like you see the divides in our country, even back then, of the different experiences that people had.
I think like that you mentioned it makes me think like even up until like the 40s and even the 50s, like if you were in the very rural countryside, like you were still using an outhouse. Like they didn't have indoor plumbing. They couldn't afford it. Yeah. And so even up until like, the 50s where we're thinking of like the rise of like radio and TVs and cars and stuff, people still were, it's like a very big divide. Let's see. Why do you think it's important to share these like harrowing stories that you talk about survival with a young reader audience? Why is it important to expose them to kind of these stories?
Well, I think that that's such a great question. And first of all, not these stories aren't for all kids, for sure. I think that they're very intense. But I'm actually, I must say, like continually surprised that so many kids read them, because especially as time has gone on, the books have become, and because I'm following the lead of the readers, I am taking on topics that are intense. I think it's important, I've said this a lot. It came to me, kind of late. I'm kind of slow. It took me like 15 books to realize like, wow, they're really not about history and they're really not about disasters or battles. Really what's interesting to me, and I think what kids are gravitate to, is it's that theme of resilience. How do we get through? Not how, like, I went to the basement and hid from the tornado, or, I ran away when, in the Battle of Brooklyn. But I don't mean tactically, I mean emotionally. How do we go through really difficult events? How come so many people, my mother-in-law lived with me for 10 years, and she became one of my closest friends, and she went through the Holocaust, and she was a, refugee. And just the stuff that she went through was just, beyond imagination. And yet she just had this incredible laugh, a huge capacity for joy. How do you move forward after something so traumatic? How do you move forward if you've lost your home in a wildfire? How are the people of Paradise rebuilt? Many of them determined to rebuild. So I think that's what's interesting is, you don't just instantly survive. It's actually a bad name for the series, because you don't just survive and move on. You have to heal. You need a lot of help. You have to know how to ask for help. We have to help each other. So I think that that's why sharing these stories with kids that have, resilient stories, models, it's really important, I think. I think it's really, especially in a time like now, kids, I think it's important for them to see that what they're going through, while it's unique, it's not, other people have faced really difficult times and have been able to move forward.
I think that directly reflects from the work, that message, because at the end, you've got a scene where Max is looking at his scar, and he's like, oh, I survived that, and I'd almost forgotten about it. And he says, the Nazis scarred me and other places too, my mind, my heart. I doubt those wounds will ever fully heal. But we kind of see him trying to move forward. And I think that, like I said, directly reflects the message you're trying to convey, because it's not just about that one instance, you got away. It's about kind of the aftermath, and how do you push through that kind of heartache? How do you push through that traumatic experience and come out, more or less a better person on the other side because of it?
Yeah, you're so right. And I think too, I think that also the idea that it's okay, that you maybe are not the same exactly as the way you were, right? You do feel sad. You don't just get over things, but people do move on, and it's okay to bring some sadness with you. And it's okay to have your heart, feel your broken heart sometimes, even years and years later when you think back. And I think that also normalizing that for kids, helping them understand what it means to get over something, isn't forgetting it. It isn't, never talking about it, never feeling sad about it. But just, you can still move forward and have moments of feeling lost or sorrowful. Doesn't mean you can't, still have a joyful life and be in love and, successful and all those things.
And thank you for saying that, just because normalizing those emotions, I feel like kids especially, even some adults, need to understand it's okay to feel that way, and we need to normalize it as a society, and not to be don't cry, right. Bury it down deep inside, and it's okay to do those things. It's okay to feel sadness and hurt and anger and all of this stuff.
Right. And there's a strength to that too, right? It's strong to do that. It's strong to be really scared or really sad, and to own it. and to still be living your life. So anyway, these are things. And I think, what I always tell kids is that my characters are fictional. Max and Xena are fictional characters in the Nazi invasion book. But they're really based. I read so many memoirs. I mean, that story in particular was so informed by the true stories that I read, because that so many survivors have written about their stories, have written down their stories. So everything that happened to them and the way they articulate, a lot of that really came directly from a lot of the memoirs that I read.
What made you want to collaborate and have some of these books adapted into graphic novel form?
Well, it was funny because it wasn't my idea. The wonderful, our Scholastic has the incredible graphics imprint and the, brilliant David Saylor, and the team there is just quietly, modestly awesome. I wasn't that. I've always loved graphic novels really more. It's like you and I share our sort of teacherly. I mean, I'm not a teacher, but because they've made reading accessible to so many more kids, I think. And so when my editor suggested, said that they wanted to adapt them, at first I was like, I was very confused. I thought, well, my books are already really accessible. Like I just with these even, and why would you want to take the same story and adapt, the same story, the same characters? But then after talking a lot first of all, I trust them completely. So of course I was like, anything you want to do, of course. And thank you. But also talking to a lot of my teacher and librarian friends, they were really excited because they see how the books can work in tandem, even for, as a scaffold, the graphic novels can be a step into the regular novels. There's a lot of comparing. And then it was just, I have to say, how the secret to life is low expectations. I mean, it wasn't that I didn't expect anything, but I didn't know what to expect. So when I saw the first draft of the Titanic book that Georgia had adapted, and the artists of House Studio, this incredible group of artists from Argentina, I just was like, I was truly like blown away by everything about it, how they interpreted my story. So I feel so like, it was a very profound experience in some way to watch someone take my characters that I feel so attached to in this story that I worked so hard on. And it just felt like they really lovingly took it, and like care, and then turned it into something like I couldn't even imagine. So and every book has been the same, the Shark Attack book and now the Nazi invasion book was just a completely different experience. So it's been a very, just, I don't know, mind-blowing experience and watching them do this. I'm just dazzled.
I cannot even imagine how much it takes, like to take, something that's already written and then try to like adapt it. And like you said, like parts, how do you like cut that down into like graphic novel form and take away, but still keep the impact the same?
Yes. That's what it was that's what was so shocking to me, is that Georgia is able to sort of take my story and it's pretty much the same language I've used, it's like, and sort of it's like she boils, I don't know if you cook, but it's like, when you're making a sauce and you're boiling it down to get the flavors, less volume, but you keep, the more flavor. So it's been, it's just exciting to have, these new creative experiences. And of course, to be, in a different role of really just helping as I can and, supporting and admiring them.
As an educator, I've had other educators kind of question the legitimacy of graphic novels in the classroom and comic books, and look at them as not really literature. They kind of look at them as like, oh, this is, for kids. Like it's not really meant to be used. So I completely disagree with that. But what would you say to teachers who might have this viewpoint? Like, would you agree or disagree? Or how would you suggest to a teacher who might feel this way to start using like these graphic novels as like a gateway to some of these kids that need that to get into more, I guess, heavy reading? Because I've seen some versions adapted. I've seen manga and graphic novels of like Les Mis, and that tells the story and it gets it to these kids who are not going to sit and read like 400, 500 pages of Victor Hugo.
Well, that's such a, I think I might have views about this that are like not cool for someone who works at Scholastic for all the years that I've been there, because of course, I love the company and it's an edge, we're with the reading. We really are all about reading, but I feel like it's really about, I think that there's too much emphasis on reading and not enough on knowing. So the question I would have is, you want kids to learn. You want them to get the information, to have access to characters and experiences and knowledge and worlds and ideas, right? So however they might consume those, whether it's reading a 400-page book or a graphic novel or watching a video, or, I think the important thing is for them to get the knowledge, because it's also been shown that if you don't have prior knowledge, reading becomes that much more difficult. So every year you don't read, the opportunity to access stories that require, like we were talking about, the context for like understanding World War II in high school. And if I'm in your class and I'm 15 and I was not a reader, there's so much that I just don't get. But if I was given a steady diet of really exciting graphic novels about history, I'm going to be just as adept as my friend who is slogging through, just loving David McCullough, reading these, big adult books. So that's my feeling about it. And most of the teachers that I have, I know so many teachers from my work, and they're really, I think, more and more excited about graphic novels for that. And I do think that they see them, sometimes as just, as a way of building knowledge and getting kids who normally wouldn't read to learn in this way, but also as a way of like, I have a lot of teachers now who are saying that kids read my graphic novel and then they were really eager to read the novel. Mm-hmm. And it helped really lay the groundwork for reading in a way that the child wasn't as comfortable or interested.
Yeah, I think this next question kind of ties into that. Like, what strengths do you find in using a comic book or a graphic novel format versus like a prose and like just written word? Like, what are the strengths or the positives you think to that?
Well, I think that, certainly reading, reading a traditional book, you're getting a higher concentration of vocabulary. I do think there's something to be said that there's no study that shows that loving reading helps you be more successful. There's a lot of studies, or every study shows that being able to read and sustain your stamina to get through something that you're not interested in, frankly, is super important. We all have to do that. Like, I have a sewing machine. I had to learn how to use it. I had to read the manual, right? But you have to be willing to do that. So I think that it's really important for kids. I think we have to separate loving to read from knowing how to read and being able to read and reading because you understand it's important. So I think it is super important to have both. But I think for learning for getting kids who are who struggle, or English is a second language, or I think that the graphic novels have it's an enormous, it's like a treasure, right? To have these books out there for those kids. So I think it's really important to have both. I don't think you can have graphic, and I think that, I think actually I would also say that on the flip side, it's wonderful for kids. It's really important for kids to learn how to read graphic novels and comics, because that's a whole other, the imagination that you need, this, the ability to sort of fill in context. You have to, my graphic novels are harder in some ways. Kids don't realize it because you have to make more inferences. You have to fill in the blanks. It's not spelled out for you. So there is a very deliberative reading process that can go with graphic novels that you don't need to employ with a traditional novel, I think. But that could be totally wrong.
No, you're completely right. Last year, I was able to do it this year, but last year I did a lesson. It was on 9/11, and I kind of talk a little bit about that. And so I did, I don't know if you've ever read it or heard of it, but Marvel released a Spider-Man comic, and it was on the day, and it showed what happened. And it was like Spider-Man and like the Avengers and trying to save as many people as they could. And then people were like, why couldn't you save everyone? And it's just kind of, it showed that. So I incorporated that into the classroom and had the kids read it, and we analyzed it. But I had to go through and show a PowerPoint. I was like, this is how you read a graphic novel or a comic book. It goes this way, and you have to look at this, and this is what those bubbles mean. And then this bubble means, a thought. And kind of showing them that, because like you said, it's a completely different world when you read those.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important, like you said, just trying to get them to read. Like, you don't have to love it. One of my things I also ask my kids, like their intro to class survey, like getting to know them, like, what's your favorite book? About 95% of them put like, I don't read, or I don't have one. And it kind of breaks my heart a little bit, because I love to read, but, just trying to, throughout the year, I try to like, okay, let's try to read this. As long as you're reading something, I have like a small like classroom library that I've set up. I'm like, if you want to check out any books and like read anything during like your free time, then you're good.
Oh, I wish I were in your class.
Thank you. Let's see. At the end of the novel, The Back Matter, it has a lot of historical background and a timeline of events, which I loved. I love sitting there, like already knowing like all of this stuff. I was like, oh, that's cool. That's so cool. It's in here. And like, I love the timeline. Oh, like it's got D-Day in there. It's got this timeline when like Battle of Stalingrad. And I was like, that was so cool to see that. So did you have input of what you wanted to go into that information? Was that kind of like, I want this, this, and this?
Yes. I mean, so I wrote, I always have a lot of back matter in all the books. And I do also want to just say, I forgot to mention probably the most important person in all of, in my work with the graphic novels is my editor, Katie Weir. Katie, she's the editor of my books, of my novels, and she has taken on these graphic novels. She works with graphics as well. But so for something like the back matter, of figuring out, she's not only figuring out, most of it came from the original book, but we did fill it out more. And she's the one who saw a lot of really wonderful opportunities for interpreting that visually and thinking about how to package that nonfiction information in a way that was consistent with the graphic novel format, but also fit as much information as possible in the most accessible way. So, with World War II, it was hard because we had a lot of discussions about that, there's always more you want to have in there. But then when you open up the door, even the Battle of Stalingrad was a big question, because it's really hard. Like, kids don't understand. It's like Russia, but it's the Soviet Union, but it's Stalingrad, but it's not, it's, again, I don't ever like to include information that where their kids were without the context and without previously providing a little bit of a foundation, because it just feels kind of callow, like, oh, throw it in because you have to throw it in, right? Or just so we said, oh, we included that. So it's another intense part of that process, is deciding what facts to use and making sure they all fit together.
I love the, just sitting there and reading it. And there was like the question, I like how like some of the characters were asking questions, and then it filled in the gaps and like answered it. And one was like the main question that I have a lot of kids ask, like, how did Hitler get away? Like, how did he rise to power? How could somebody so crazy be allowed to do this stuff and become a leader? And like, I love it. The answer, like, he promised them, like, they were in a rough spot. And if you're starving and you need somebody to help you come out of that mess, like, you're going to listen to their message. And then later on, they're going to kind of like do their bad stuff. But by then it's too late. You've already opened the door for them. So I thought, like, I got a little kick out of that, like being able to read all of the different, nonfiction aspects that were thrown into this. It was really cool. And seeing like also like the actual like historical photos of like the images and stuff were pretty cool too.
Well, good. I'm really glad you like all that, because that so much work goes into that. And I think that it's also, I'm so happy that we have the opportunity to have the back matter, because when I finish writing a book, by the time I'm done, I have so much, it's like the cutting room floor, I just have so much more information that I want to give the kids, but can't weave it all into the story. And then to have the opportunity to really consider carefully after the book is done, what are the questions that a kid is going to have? Where are the gaps? And to really, so it might not be necessarily all the information, but really to focus on what doors were opened, what are things I can answer in a paragraph, or in the case of, or a panel or two in the graphic novels, and then what is best for the kid to learn on their own, and maybe pointing them in the direction of other books they can read.
Perfect. Dan, do you want to ask this last question we have right here?
Yes. So, our last question is another pretty hard-hitting one. If you had a Rube Goldberg machine, what would it do?
It would write my books, Dan. No question. In fact, when just even the term of like that, it would fill like a whole room. It would involve my dog running on a treadmill, like some sort of like feather pet quill, and steam powered something, and I don't know what. So that's what right after I'm done with you guys, I'm going to get to work on that.
Well, we were so glad to have you. This is the third graphic novel adaptation in the I Survived series, I Survived the Nazi Invasion, and it goes on sale February 2nd, 2021. It'll be out in hardcover and paperback at the same time, and it is available for pre-order. So, Lauren, where can people find you online?
You can find me at laurentarshis.com.
You can find us at GayCrashersPod on Instagram and Twitter, and you can find us at our website at gaycrashers.fan. See you next week.